Hi, Marcus. Welcome to the exit ticket.
All right. How's
Woo,
it going?
woo. It's great. It's really great to see you. Happy summer.
Happy summer. It's
Thank you.
been a very restful and relaxing summer, so I'm very good. I'm very happy with that.
Yes, yes.
Even
You've
here.
had some unintentional rest
Yes,
because of your arm.
yes,
Yes,
definitely.
yes.
So,
Marcus, I wonder if you'd start by introducing yourself. Tell us what sort of environment you work at, what you do.
sure. My name's Marcus. I'm a second grade teacher at a school, an independent school here in San Francisco. It's an all boys school. I work primarily with seventh and eight or 7 and 8 year olds. That's the second grade age range. I also work with some older kids in a tutoring capacity. So
Mm.
I tutor three sixth graders and two fourth graders. And so I kind of get a breadth of sort of a range of the spectrum of child development. So it's kind of
Mm.
exciting. Yeah,
And could you explain a little bit about what some of your teaching values are,
sure.
what drives you, and maybe they had to evolve over COVID. So I'd love to know
Yeah,
what your foundations are and then where they've had to go.
yeah. So I think from the beginning of my teaching career, one of the things that has always sort of resonated with me has been relationships.
Mm.
I in my grad school program, one of the emphasis was on relationship building as a way to bridge the home school gap. And
Mm.
so the first 3 years that I taught, I did home visits with all of my family. So before school would start, I would have a 45-minute meeting with the family at their home or at a designated place of their choice, a park, a cafe. And I would sit down and just meet with the parents. And because I did this before meeting their child, I was actually able to build rapport with parents and have that sort of foundation for tough conversations or challenging conversations, but
Mm.
also like praise and excitement. Like we had that relationship. And since coming into the independent school world, that's definitely changed for me. And my relationship building is not as primarily focused on the adults, and it's become more centered in the students. And so uh, over the last, I don't know, year of COVID, that relationship building has actually become integral in my ability to teach my boys. And yes, I'll call them my boys. They're my boys now.
Yes.
They'll be my boys forever. And, it's funny because, sorry, side note, I had one come back uh, for tutoring this summer and he was like, do I get to still be in your crew? And I was like, of course you do. So, but going back, I would say that in the era of COVID, that relationship building was actually the most important component of my job on a day-to-day basis. It was creating that environment where kids felt seen, they felt heard, they felt like I was pushing them academically, but I also, when they fell down, I was the first person there to check on them, to be like, are you okay? What can I do for you? What do you need right now? Right. And like really holding that emotional space for kids
Mm.
and for my students. And I think that was the biggest sort of shift in my uh teaching values, relationship being number one, integrity being number two.
Mm.
And I'll just speak a little bit to that in that at our school, as you know, integrity is one of our core values. And one of the things that I thought about this year a lot was how do I bring integrity into the classroom and demonstrate that? Right. And so that meant like taking ownerships when I made mistakes, when I called the wrong kid out for something, like which we do.
Mm.
And then you realize later, like, oh no, you were the wrong
Mm.
kid. So you have to go back and you have to make amends again, tied to relationship building, right? Like being able to say you're sorry and to say, like, I made a mistake
Mm.
actually pays dividends in your relationship building with them.
Mm.
And so, it wasn't just my mistakes, but it was all things, right? And so when we had a student test positive for COVID, I was very direct with them and very honest with them, and I held that integrity for them. When it came to
Mm,
talking about January 6th and sort of the insurrection, I held that space of integrity and saying, like, I need to talk to you about this,
mm,
right? Like, this is really important. I want to tell you about something that happened. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just trying to be very transparent with you.
mm,
Um, when it came to, the 8 people in Georgia who were massacred, right,
mm,
because they were Asian, we had to talk about that.
mm,
When it came to the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial,
mm,
I wanted to make sure that they were prepared for that
mm,
in case there was any sort of negative repercussions that came out of the verdict. And so I sat him down and I said, look, I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
mm,
I really don't. Here's what I want you to know. I want you to know that 2 things can happen. Here are the 2 things that we're going to be prepared for.
mm,
And if you have questions, like, I'm here to answer them for you. I will only speak from what I know. I won't guess. And if I come to a space of where something that I don't know, I'm gonna put that in our parking lot and I'm gonna come back to it. And really that way it comes full circle, right? And they're getting the answers that they
mm,
need and the answers that they want, but
mm,
they also feel that relationship, right? Like, they feel that place of safety and
mm.
security and, like, being vulnerable and being honest with themselves because I'm modeling it for them. So I think, as I think about my teaching practices, those are the 2 values that really resonate with me. Um, I think it kind of goes back to some of my childhood, and I bring that forward. So, yeah, that was a very long-winded answer.
It's a beautiful answer in this circle of relationship and integrity, that
Yeah,
having integrity builds rapport, that having rapport and enforces integrity. I love that. And there are so many different places I can go with the content of what you just shared, but I have been incredibly curious about how educators handled George Floyd, January 6th,
yeah.
Asian hate against Asian Americans. You got right there. So I'd love to hear both, how did Marcus deal with it? How did Mr. Stevens do this?
Yeah.
And how was Marcus feeling through this?
Perfect. Yeah. So I think when it comes to things like George Floyd, um, and sort of that Asian hate that we saw at the beginning of this year, and communities still continue to feel, right? Like,
Mm,
even though it's not on the news every day, like, there are things that are still happening. Um, these kids are not oblivious to that,
mm,
right? Like, study after study after study has shown us that by age 3, ideas around race have been formulated in children's minds. And so even at age 7 or 8, I'm actively working to counter those narratives, right? Like,
mm,
and really pushing the boys, the students, to see the individual action or incident, and also to think about it in the larger
mm,
context, right? Little anecdote, and a lot of this work I haven't done myself. A lot of this they bring with them. Some of it they
mm,
bring from home, some of it in the conversations they've had at home, or in the year previously with their previous teacher. Like, they bring stuff forward and it actually will, like, knock your socks off because you're not prepared for it, right? We as teachers spend a lot of time preparing and thinking through what I'm going to say, and what if this question gets asked, how am I going to answer that? If this question doesn't get asked, how do I bring it up?
mm,
Right. So you're always thinking about, like, what they're going to think about. And so in second grade, we do a lot of work around change makers. What is a change maker? How is a change maker sort of embodied? What characteristics or values do they have? How do they affect change? And, like, for second graders, can be kind of, like, abstract, but we do so much of it that they start to understand it. And I read a book about Cesar Chavez. I think it was back in September. No, it was in October because we had come back to school. And one of the boys, after I finished reading the book, he raised his hand and said, Mr. Stevens, this reminds me a lot about how Black people and George Floyd have been treated.
Oh.
And I was like, wow, like that's an amazing connection you're making there, friend. Like, and I was actually not expecting that. That was one of the ones that I didn't prepare for. And it's literally making the hairs stand up on my neck right now, because that ability to sort of make those connections from one person's story and narrative to another person's story and narrative helps create empathy. And without empathy, we don't have the ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to see what their experiences were like, or not necessarily see, but to understand and appreciate,
Oh.
right? And so, I've always sort of just tried to, with all of these events, to be as transparent as possible. I have specifically named white supremacy. I have specifically named terrorism in these events. I've specifically named, that these things are what they are, and we have to accept that, right? Like George Floyd's death was a murder. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? Like, and we dissected why. His hands were behind his back. He was on the ground. He was not resisting. That knee on the neck, that was murder, right? Or talking about the 8 people in Georgia. It's, talking about the hate that resides inside someone to specifically target a group of people, like, and understanding not only how that community that had the violence perpetuated against them is feeling, but what drives that person to feel that way? What drives someone to hate like that? And, I think every teacher says this, and you don't have to love everyone in this class, but you have to treat them with respect. And you have to have that shared value. And I think, that comes into sort of my third value that's really important, is respect. And so, I name when I see it, I name when I don't see it, I name when I don't feel it. I think that as educators, we have to model appropriate language. And so I will use I statements. I will say, I am not feeling respected right now because I gave directions and this is what happened. This is what I expect. This is what happened. And this is how it's making me feel. And, as time goes on, they sort of pick up on that. And, kids want to do good. They want to be good kids, and they make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes, but we just got to call them out. So I think I digressed from your original question a little bit there. But I think if I really want to go back to your initial question about how do I deal with these conversations, not deal with them, but how do I bring these conversations into the classroom, and how does Marcus bring them versus how does Mr. Stevens bring them? One particular struggle I've had, and as a gay man, like, this is really personal to me, and I'm not quite sure how to bring it up or how to talk about it. I think because it starts to open up some other doors that are not necessarily developmentally appropriate for a second grade student. But in second grade at our school, we specifically learn about the different neighborhoods within our community. And so, the boys will, in previous years, have gone to Chinatown, and they've been, led by a local tour guide who shows them some of the important places, the clubs, the community centers, the places of community building. We went to the Mission, they did mural making, and they went and saw like some of the political statements that art can represent. And then we got to the Castro. And I started to have a lot of unease, and I'll share with you why. I don't think that you can talk about the lived experience of gay men and women and LGBTQI plus communities without talking about the impact of HIV and AIDS.
Mm.
Been an entire generation of men die.
Mm.
And our government did nothing about it for years. I mean, Ronald Reagan would not even acknowledge that AIDS was a crisis for 7 years, and hundreds of thousands of people have died in the United States and millions across the world because we did nothing. So how do I take these boys into the Castro and talk about change makers and talk about the community's lived experience without talking about the impact of HIV and AIDS? But how do I also bridge that gap in a developmentally appropriate way, given the fact that HIV and AIDS is primarily transmitted through sex, through intravenous drug use? Like, you know, how do you talk about that with a 7-year-old who doesn't understand quite how the birds and the bees work just yet, right? Like, so, you know, also trying to think about like, how do I bring this to them in an authentic and meaningful way that also like shares my community's history without whitewashing it, right? Without saying like, you know, oh, like the whitewashing that's been done in every other community that's been marginalized or oppressed over the last 400 years, right? And is you have to speak to their lived experience. And I can't do that. And so I haven't figured out a way to do that yet. Growth mindset, modeling, okay? I have not figured out a way to do that just yet. And there's really not a lot of resources that are available for kids on this subject. And I think it affects kids more than we think, right? Like, you know, I have friends who are parents who are HIV positive. And so like, how do we talk about that with those families, right? How do we bring their lived experiences into the classroom so that they feel seen and heard? Are you familiar with windows and mirrors? The idea of windows and mirrors. So a lot of times what we talk about is this idea of windows and mirrors, that when I pick up a book, I can, in a mirror, I see my own lived experience reflected in the content of the book, right? I see myself, I see my family, I see the things that like resonate with me. That's a mirror. A window is when I pick up a book and I get to learn about someone else's experience. I get to see the world through their eyes. I get to sort of peek into their window and see what their life is about. And so we work so hard with windows and mirrors around race, around gender, around, you know, ethnic identity, but we don't bring other areas like ability and able-bodiedness or gender identity or sexuality, right? And I will admit, that I have my own insecurities that sort of prevent me from doing that in a really authentic way. And just being super real with you, I think that being a man who teaches young kids, as well as being a gay man, there are double standards that exist within my professional career that my cis female colleagues do not have to worry about. And so, you know, I worry about the families who are going to come in and say, oh, you're preaching to our children about gayness, or, oh, you're trying to convert them, or, oh, you're being inappropriate. Like, I have to worry about all of that stuff on a daily basis. And so when I'm starting to sweat now just because it's like, it's so real, right? Like, and it's this place of how do I share my lived experience and be authentic to me in a way that's not going to offend people.
Wow.
And it's something I struggle with. I mean, this is my 7th year of teaching and I still haven't figured that out. In the past, I have been married for my teaching career. You know, things happen, I'm single now. And however, having the picture of Brian on the wall and my rainbow flag, like I would introduce him to the boys at the beginning of the year and say, this is my husband. We've been together for X number of years. Like, and it was like a natural, safe way to like sort of come out to them in that way. And now that I don't have that anymore, I'm starting to think about like, how do I tell them? How do, and making it natural and not making it this like, all right, boys, I have something to tell you right now. Okay. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they're gonna be like, okay, and right? Like, but when you start to like, when you can build an empathetic connection. My husband, he and I have been married for X number of years. Did you know that when you were born, we couldn't get married? Right? And it became like this, like, whoa, did you know? And like, and you know, I'd sort of would weave that into some of the other conversations that we would have about discrimination, about bias, around about racism. Like I would also sort of bring that up, and it was very natural. And so now I have to sort of reimagine how I do that. So, which is interesting and hard and feels scary and unknown. And I'm 42 years old. I've come out to everybody and their mother. Like, I don't know why coming out to 7 and 8-year-olds feels terrifying right now.
Because it is still a coming out.
Yeah, it is. So, yeah.
So I am hearing that bias, discrimination, hate, disrespect is really important and painful for you. And something that I'm loving that I hear you say is, how do I do that? Because you're speaking to a teacher who always has to do, right? But what I would love to know is how do these things make Marcus feel? Like, take me through the emotional experience of somebody who cares so deeply about all of this.
Yeah. Well, I have a bunch of thoughts on this. I think the fractured nature of our society at the moment is making some of that really difficult. I think that in a world that is so vitriolic, staying positive and staying on the right side of the moral compass can be hard, because it's really easy to fall into those places of name calling, othering, differentiating yourself. I mean, we're seeing it now, right? Like the backlash of unvaccinated people. We're just othering people. Even though, like, yes, morally, I'm like, get your effing vaccine, please. I also am recognizing that it's creating a stigma of other in a new community. And it seems like we tend to do that a lot and other each other in so many different ways, that part of what I have to do on a daily basis is help the boys recognize each other's humanity for what it is. We're people, we're human beings. We have feelings, we have aspirations, we have dreams, we have fears, we have insecurities, but it's a balance. It's about finding that balance, right? And one of the things I think in thinking of that balance is just this idea of growth mindset. The word yet is really important in my classroom. So a kid will come up and say like, I'm a terrible speller. And I'll say, well, you can't spell that yet, but you're going to get there. Right. And like, I'll make a big deal out of it in the first couple of weeks of school, and I'll even write it on the board and circle it. And then like, by the third week it's been up there, if someone says something to me, I just go, and they're like, I'll get there, right? And so like it is about shifting it's about shifting the paradigm in which they think about themselves, right? And so getting them to see sort of less of the individualism and more of the collectivism helps with the respect. It helps with the integrity. It helps with the relationship building, because, you know, I don't know about you, but Steph Curry didn't win 3 NBA titles playing all by himself. he needed his teammates. And for boys, sports resonates a lot. So we get a lot of sports analogies. But you have to work together as a team. And when we win together, we celebrate. And when we fail together, we reflect.
Mm.
So, you know, I'm kind of a hard ass. Okay.
Mm.
And I have really high expectations because I know that they
Yes.
can meet them.
Yes.
Sometimes I have to pull them back and say, that didn't meet my expectations. I know you can do it. I've seen you do it. I'm asking for these 3 things to happen right now.
Mm.
Give me a thumbs up if you can make that work. Great, let's try. Right. And so then we try again. I love do it again. It's one of my favorite classroom management tools, because it helps them understand what I'm expecting out of them.
Mm.
Right. And so, yeah.
So I think I'm hearing that you are so living in your authenticity that it's really important for you to transmit it to your students. And that's what integrity is. That's how you build empathy. But this is all anchored in you knowing who you are and what are your values.
Um, 100%. I 100% agree with that. I think that as teachers, you need to have your core values as well as the school's core values, if that's a thing for them. And I think that if you anchor your classroom experience in those core values and you name them for your students, it actually leads to a more cohesive and dynamic classroom experience because kids see you modeling authenticity and then they try it out. Kids love to do the things that they see, right? For lack of a better term, we have a saying in the classroom, monkey see, monkey do, right? Like when one kid sees something, another kid tries it. Or when a kid sees a teacher model vulnerability, when a kid sees a kid, or when a kid sees a teacher break down talking about George Floyd and talking about how it hurts, like that to them is that silent okay. It's okay to be myself. It's that tacit approval of I can cry, I can be sad. My teacher's done it for me. My teacher has shown me. And then the way that the kids respond too, right? Like, I did get really emotional when we were talking about the verdict for George Floyd because I'm a kid of the 90s. I watched the Rodney King trials and I watched on live TV the riots in LA for 5 days. Like, so I was acutely aware of the potential impacts. I was also acutely aware of the impact on his family that this decision was going to have. And that's who I thought about. And so when I was thinking about them and when I was talking and explaining what was going on, like I started to cry. And I had to stop myself for a few minutes and just like collect myself. I didn't lash out. I didn't get angry. I didn't get upset. I didn't storm off. Like I was really modeling for them. Okay, I need to take a breath. And I even had my eyes closed. And if I recall correctly, I said to them, I said, guys, I need a minute, just 1 second. And I just sat there and I went quiet and I closed my eyes, took a couple deep breaths. And I was like, all right, sorry, that was a lot for me to handle. I was seeing a lot of emotions right now. I just needed a moment. And so silently giving them that approval to ask for their own moments and modeling for them, I think that vulnerability and acceptance of emotion is really important. I will also say that I'm very passionate about breaking that masculine archetype that we're not in touch with our emotions as men, and that it's okay to cry, it's okay to feel things, it's okay to be disappointed, to be excited, to be frustrated, to be happy. Like there's a whole emotion wheel of things we can feel, and it's okay. Right? And so modeling that for them, letting them try it out, giving them feedback, right? When they have their moments like, hey, I noticed you did this. That was awesome. Next time, maybe you want to try this too. Maybe this will help. Okay, you took your breath. Do you need to get up and just go get a drink of water too? Okay, try that. If that's not enough, try that. All right. and then we'll talk about it a little bit later. I try not to like apply on the pressure in those moments, but giving them space too, to like,
Mm,
I'll check in later and be like, did that help? Cool. It didn't help. All right, well, next time let's try something different. So
mm.
yeah.
I'm really appreciating that um, your authentic experience models authenticity for your students, for your boys. And one, you're showing it is okay to be myself in the era of, it sounds like, it really sounds like to me, racial injustice is even in some ways more than like COVID, right? Like in this era, how how do you be yourself? Like how you're bringing it to the classroom, but how do you take care of yourself? Who takes care of you?
Mhm.
How do you have that anchor to self so that you can clearly bring it to your classroom?
God, I hate this term, but self-care, I think
Okay.
it's become really over indulged lately.
Mhm.
Um, but I have a therapist. I see him every 2 weeks. I, bring these challenging conundrums that I have for myself to him. We talk about that. I am also just an active learner. I love to constantly learn. So I'm always reading articles
Mm,
or books that kind of speak to how to
mm,
overcome those barriers, um, and how to be our true selves.
mm,
But I also think that I make lots of mistakes.
mm,
I am not perfect. I sometimes sometimes don't hold my composure the way I want to.
mm,
Um, in the classroom or in these conversations. And I think that I'm still in this journey of figuring out how
mm,
do I anchor myself. I anchor myself though in that I'm very secure in who I am. I am a cis white male. I have been the beneficiary of white privilege. I have been the beneficiary of sexist privilege. I have, as a man who teaches lower school, I think that I automatically kind of get bumped up in application piles. So I'm always cognizant of that because, teaching is 75% women and 25% men, right? And so I recognize my own privileges and I kind of don't let those get too far from my day to day.
mm,
And so, like I was saying earlier, in terms of I'm still struggling to figure out how to bring my authentic self in the aspects of like my LGBTQI identity,
mm,
right? And so I'm not perfect. I'm still a work in progress, but I've never given up on myself. And I've never
mm,
settled for where I am, right? Like I want to be the best role model for my students that I can be. So that means that I have to be in a constant state of growth. I have
mm,
to be willing to challenge my own ways of thinking and do it publicly in front of them too and model that,
mm,
right? Like I can't always have, I don't know if you do this in your classroom, but a lot of times I take the inner dialogue that I'm having and I verbalize it just so that the boys and students will know like,
mm,
this is what's going through his mind, right? And so I don't know, I'm a work in progress. I'm not all the way there,
mm,
but I also recognize the importance of the work that I do. And
mm,
if I didn't have these conversations, what disservice am I doing to my students?
mm,
Right? Thinking about all of the backlash around critical race theory, um, that's currently going on in our political world. Granted, we all know that critical race theory is like a
mm,
graduate level course. But when we get into the classroom and we talk about anti-racism and we talk about bias and we talk about prejudice and we talk about segregation and the history of slavery and settler colonialism and all these things, like I can't let go of that. I cannot
mm,
not talk to them about that,
mm,
right? Like again, it's like that conversation, like I was saying earlier about like, how do I share my community's lived experience while
mm,
omitting a huge chunk of it?
mm,
How do I talk about my Black students' lived experience without talking about segregation or slavery
Mm,
or the
mm,
effects of policing on communities of color? How do we talk about Asian American hate without understanding the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? Like we have to bring these conversations, because
mm,
as much as we want to believe we're in a post-racial society, we're actually not. I think we've actually been the most divided we've ever
mm,
been.
mm,
I think that I, I will not go into my conspiracy world of pigeonhole, but I think that white nationalism is going to be a problem. And I think that, like, as white educators, we need to be bringing it up now,
mm,
right? So that kids, when they become older, don't fall into those traps,
mm,
right? Like, if I can teach my white boys about their privilege now, what will they do with that in 10
mm,
years? How will that shift the paradigm of their own thinking? How will that affect the conversations they have in fifth grade when they talk about westward expansion in the US? How will that affect them in, seventh and eighth grade, when in historical context they're studying ancient civilizations and this concept and this myth of Columbus discovering the new world? He didn't discover the new world, it was already here. There are already millions of people living here, right? And so if we don't have those conversations early, we do a disservice.
mm,
And just kind of, sorry, tying back to what was said earlier, study after study after study after study has shown that kids understand the social construct of race we've created
mm,
by 3, by 4, by 5. So
mm,
at 5, when they enter kindergarten, we have to actively be breaking down those
mm,
thought processes and rebuilding more harmonious thought processes that are more inclusive, that
mm,
respect diversity, that embrace diversity.
mm.
So,
Well, Marcus, if my question was, how do you take care of yourself? And I'm hearing the return of this is so important to me. Am I to understand that the act of teaching, the act of doing for you is how you process your feelings in the world around, like they are they so linked?
hmm, it's a good question. I think perhaps the doing is the catharsis that's needed, right? So, like, when I have these difficult conversations with my boys, maybe that act of enlightening them actually becomes the self-care for me, because I know
Mm,
that I'm creating the future that I want to be a part of.
mm,
And that's actually an interesting observation that I hadn't quite thought of before,
mm,
but is an interesting one to consider. I think I think of it like a recipe, right? Like, when we cook something and we follow a recipe and it doesn't turn out the way we want it to, we try again,
mm.
right? In teaching, I don't get the ability to try again. Not, well, I will, but a year later, or a
Ah.
different subject later, right? Um, being an elementary school teacher, I teach a lesson and I won't teach it again for a whole nother year. When we come back to it, right? And I think that's different between, like, middle and upper school teachers who, teach 4 things, the same thing 4 different times in a row. And they have that sort of feedback model that gives them the ability to
Mm,
adjust and change. I don't get that. So I have to
mm,
constantly live in that, okay, this is my recipe. How do I do it so that I don't make a mistake? But I'm going to make mistakes, but that catharsis still comes out, and that resolution of, at least I'm trying to make a difference. So,
mm,
because at least I tried. And if you make 100% of the shots you don't take, right? Or you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. If I don't talk to the boys, I'm missing that opportunity.
mm,
And when I start to think about again, self-care and how do I process this stuff. You're right. It actually is a catharsis for me to come home and be like, wow, that was a really tough conversation. And it really didn't go the way I wanted it to. However, we got to talk about something that was really important to one
Mm,
of those boys.
mm,
Someone in that room felt seen. Someone in that room felt heard. Someone in
mm,
that room felt like they had a mirror looking back at them, or that they were or that perhaps they were even looking in someone else's window
mm,
and getting sort of some of that empathy built around, ooh, that probably didn't feel so good to be
mm,
treated that way. Oh, I wouldn't want to treat someone that way, or I wouldn't want to be treated that way. So yeah, I think that does become an element of the self-care.
mm.
So along with all the usual bottles of wine and gyms, exercise and eating healthy and
Right.
sleep, right? But
Being authentically yourself, bringing that to the boys, making sure you're creating spaces for mirrors and windows, not looking away from the painful aspects of life. Those are actually part of how you live authentically and practice self-care.
yeah, so
So I have two more questions.
sure.
I
I
want
have living for all your questions. So
yes. I wonder if you could, we're chatting because I'm very curious about compassion.
yeah.
And I'd love to know what you think about compassion for teachers, compassion in the classroom, like topic, compassion.
Yeah.
Go, Marcus.
Okay. I think compassion and empathy are directly intertwined. If
Mm,
you cannot put yourself in someone else's shoes, you
mm,
can't hold compassion for them when they're struggling with something, right? And so that's why I work so intentionally to really build a culture of empathy in the
mm,
classroom,
mhm,
is so that when we read a book, or when we're analyzing characters in book clubs, or when we're, thinking about ourselves as learners, like we can be compassionate for ourselves because we can be empathetic for others. We can understand, bless you, we can understand what it's like to possibly be in someone else's shoes. We can't always do that. I think that there's certain issues, especially around race, where we have to respect the story that's being told to us. We can't necessarily always put ourselves in those shoes, right? Like as a white man, I can't put myself in the shoes of a black man and understand their lived experience. I never will. What that's like, I can appreciate the
mm,
struggle and I can appreciate where it comes from,
mm,
right? Um, so again, I think just going back to building a culture of empathy in the classroom is huge. Naming emotions is huge. Uh,
mm,
Typically for a second grader, they have four emotions: happy, sad, mad, and angry. Um, and right. And so like really actively working to say like, well, happy means a lot of different things. It can mean that I'm
mm,
joyous right now, or I'm exuberant, or I'm elated, or ecstatic. Like there's all these other words that kind of build off of it.
mm,
Um, and when I'm sad, equally, I can be depressed, or I can be forlorn, or I can be introspective, right? Like I can
mm,
be all these other things than happy, mad, good, and bad, or sad,
mm,
right? Like, so building out that vocabulary around what emotions are you feeling and how do you name those,
mm,
is really important in building empathy. I think also knowing that we are all going to have our bad days, so that when someone is having a bad day, you can be like, oh, I've had one of those.
mm,
I know what that's like. Can I
mhm,
get you some water? Can I do something for you? Like, and I think that is that extension of empathy that leads into compassion.
mm.
And so I think that's really important. Kind of shifting into sort of the teacher world of compassion, I think I don't often feel a lot of compassion for the work that I do. I don't feel valued at times. I don't feel recognized. I don't feel appreciated. And I want to add a caveat to that, which is 95% of the families I work with are extremely, extremely appreciative and really value the work that I do with their children.
Mm.
As a society, we do not value teachers. There's zero compassion for teachers. During COVID, across the country, school districts were, you're going back to work, and if you don't go back to work, you lose your job. Well, what if I have children that can't be vaccinated, or I have a significant other that has a significant health issue, right? Like, not every school has been flexible in saying, oh, well, you can just keep working from home then,
Mm.
right? Like, people were given ultimatums. Look at how much teachers are paid,
Mm.
right? Like, I think it was 2018 when we had the teacher strikes in West Virginia and Arizona and Oklahoma, and there were marginal increases in the pay that teachers received. I think the average salary for a teacher in Oklahoma is like $35,000 a year. Like, that's not even poverty wages,
Mm.
right? Like, break that down and by how many hours they work, how much extra money they spend because there's
Mm.
not enough funding, right? Like, it really is poverty wages that we pay people to educate our children, which I'm just gonna go down a little rabbit hole here. Is that the intended consequence? Is the intended desire to dumb down the population as a whole,
Mm.
to make it more susceptible to lies, to
Mm.
misinformation, to not having critical thinking skills,
Mm.
right? And like, when you think about like decades and decades and decades of
Mm.
underfunding of schools, especially public schools, the rise in private schools and independent schools where wealthy families can afford to send their
Mm.
children and get the 21st century skills they need. I don't know.
Mm.
It's a big question, right? Um,
So
but I
what
don't
would compassion look like for teachers?
forgiving student loan debts as long as
Mm.
I mean, I'm tens of thousands of dollars in debt to become a teacher.
To become a teacher.
Become a teacher. Like, I literally owe the federal government $87,000. Like, for what? So that I can make poverty wages, right? Like, you want to show compassion to teachers, eliminate student debt, give everybody a raise, fund schools, make it so that teachers don't have to spend their own money to
Mm.
fulfill their classrooms. I think, we're very fortunate in that the school that we work at has a lot of resources available to it. How do schools with resources reach out to schools that don't have resources and build empathetic connections across communities?
Mm.
Right? So I don't know. Those are some of the things that I think about. I think
Mm.
about, this idea of professional development during the summer. I, I'm sorry, I just had 10 and a half months of the craziest year of my life. I do not want to do professional development right now. I want to sleep in. I want to go for hikes. I want to do the things that restore me so that when I do start teaching in August again, I'm fresh and I'm ready. I'm not tired. I haven't been working all summer. So like, I think those kinds of things um, are huge. I think, if your W-2 comes from a school, why do you pay taxes? Like, that's easy for the government to figure out.
Mm.
Right? Like, why am I paying taxes as an essential employee of the nation?
Mm.
Right? There are things that societally,
Mm.
when it comes to schools individually, you know, having coffee carts is really nice. I think that, like, having celebrations for the winter are really nice. I think the gifts are really nice. I'd really love a message from the school that said, after 6 o'clock, your teacher's not required to respond to you. I have a life. I need
Mm.
to come home and cook dinner and go and do the things that make me feel rested so that when I get up at 5 in the morning, I'm not tired
Yes.
and I can't be working until 9 o'clock.
Mm.
Right. And
Mm.
respecting my personal boundaries. That would
Mm.
be like so huge. And I think
Mm.
that's what I really have struggled with this year, because in the COVID world we lived in, I had no preps, right? Like, in our school, for example, we had those odd numbered, we had the even odd cycles, right? Well, my boys were slated to go to outdoor studies on the odd cycles. Well, guess what? We were out of school for the whole first cycle. The second cycle, third cycle, we were out of school, and we came back in the middle of the fifth cycle. So I got one day of prep, one day of prep through February. Right. And like the expectation was still that I met all of those standards and expectations that my boss has for me and that the school has for me. But I have to do that when? Before school, after school, work during my lunch break. I don't want to work during my lunch break. I want to eat my lunch. Right. Like I want to just like, I want to have that minute to say like, oh my God, that kid had a meltdown. It was his fifth today. I'm really struggling with how to meet him where he is. I need 5 minutes to myself. You know, so compassion for teachers, I think, can look a lot of different ways. Setting some really clear boundaries with parents, setting some really clear boundaries as an administrator with your employees around what your expectations are. You know, my a couple years ago, I worked at a school, and the director of the lower school at the time said, I don't expect you to answer your emails after 6. That's your time. And that was like, I felt like, I was like, oh, you mean I don't have to go home and work? And she's like, Marcus, no, you're going to burn out. You're not going to, this is not sustainable. Because, you know, I think it was my second year, and I was like copying her on difficult parent emails just so that she saw the communication. She'd be like, why are you sending that at 9 o'clock? And I was like, because that was the first time I've had to breathe today. And she'd be like, no. And she was firm about it. And she said, no, because now what you've done is you've given that parent implicit permission to email you at 9 o'clock and that you will be on it. Right. And so like helping me as a teacher understand how to build those boundaries, I think, is compassion. Holding those boundaries as an expectation from the high level admin team out to parents is compassion. I think, you know, yeah. I don't know.
I love that. Here's what else I hear you saying is compassion, appropriate compensation, financial grace, taxes, and release of student debt, an opportunity to restore yourself in the summer is compassion for teachers, respect for personal boundaries, and patience and time given for preparation of what we do in the classroom. And
I want to pause on that real quick too and just add, last year we were in a place of perpetual heightened alert, not just because of COVID, but it was like, what kid's going to email you at 9 o'clock and tell you they're on Zoom the next day, and you have to get ready for that. The blended learning of like in-person versus remote learning was really challenging. And that is something I think, again, speaking to sort of workload expectation, work-life balance, could be addressed in a more sustainable way for teachers. That 9 p.m. pivot was difficult. Because now you have to recreate your lesson, because now that kid might not have manipulatives that you're going to use in your math lesson, or they might not have the bookmark with the questions you were going to pass out for them to put in their book club book, right? So like you're constantly on edge around like, how is this going to change in 12 hours? And that is not a place that I like to live in. I am I prep a week out. All of my materials are done. I'm prepping week B during week A, right? And so for me to have to pivot on Thursday night is not always easy, because it's not just like, okay, here you go. I know you're not going to be here for a week, right? Like, because you just don't know.
It is not compassionate. It is not respectful.
Right. But at the same time, you're trying to be empathetic towards the student's school experience, right? Like you're trying to really, and for lack of a better term in the world we live in, like meet your customers' needs, right? That was also very prevalent this year in some of the conversations we had, like, right? Like we have customers who have certain demands that need to be met. they're paying for our services. Let's meet them where they're at, you know? So.
I have loved this conversation because as much as I anticipate talking to an educator and experiencing a mirror, you have actually provided this window into what it is to be fully and authentically yourself in the classroom, and how that both inspires, motivates, but also creates the hardest work of your life. How do I do? So I want to thank you for showing up truthfully in this conversation, but absolutely for showing up daily as your strong, courageous, vulnerable self for our students. I wonder if in the final moments, but please take your time with it, you could share what it's like to have spent 45 minutes processing what it is to be a teacher. Please tell me a little bit of meta. What has it been like to talk through this?
I'm gonna be real honest, and for everything difficult that I've said today and that has been challenging in the last year, my whole teaching career, I think this conversation actually has created a lot of excitement for me to get back into the classroom, because I'm excited to continue to have these challenging conversations, to get dirty and make mistakes and get my hands in the mud, right? Like, I love sitting here and hypotheticalizing and thinking about things that have happened in the past, but I'm also open to the future and how things are going to be different, right? Because every year, the next class that you get brings different challenges. And, that is an opportunity for me to grow. And like I said earlier, I am in this constant state of self-evolution, sort of self-reimaging and trying to find my best authentic self. And so I think this is really like, I can't wait. We got 3 more weeks. Wait, no, we have like 4 weeks before the first day of school.
Yes.
I'm so excited. I need to start printing labels. I need to start getting order supplies ready. And, I think it's created a lot of excitement for me. I think one of the things I'm able to do is to sort of compartmentalize my societal feelings about like the way I'm treated as a teacher, and sort of the joy that's brought to me by seeing their faces every day. Right. And I think, we didn't talk about this today, but it kind of relates back to integrity. Over the course of this past school year, I love New Balances. They're my favorite. And I have multiple pairs of them in a variety of colors. And the boys kind of built this mythology around what shoes I was wearing and what sort of mood I was going to be in for the day. And so if I wore my purple or my maroon New Balances, I was in like a trickster mood. My silver ones, I was in a truth-telling mood. I was going to be real honest with you. And like, they created all of this. Each pair of shoes that I had a different theme for it. And so like, one day one of the boys said, "Mr. Stevens, what's for snack today?" And I said, let me look. And I pulled up my phone and I was like, oh, it says broccoli and ranch. And then they were like, no. And I was like, that's what it says. You can take it up with Chef Jerry. I'm not making the decisions. I'm just reading you what it says. And one kid goes, "He's wearing the purple shoes, guys. He's wearing the purple shoes." And so it became like this thing. And so like, I don't know. I'm excited to get back into it.
You're excited to get back. So the experience of reflecting on what you called earlier like a brutal year has actually made you excited for wow, beautiful.
Yes.
Oh, beautiful.
There's a silver lining in everything out there. You just have to be willing to find it and to do the work to find it, right? So whether that's COVID, whether that's student loans, whether it's, children who are having really hard times, there's a silver lining in everything out there. You have to stay positive.
Wow, this opportunity to chat with you is a silver lining. Thank you, Marcus.
You're my silver lining.
Yes, thank you.
It was good to talk to you.